Welcome everybody to Healthy at Home webinar, Tuesday at 2. Learned that from Allison. It's a good thing to remember, Tuesday at 2, or was it Vicky? Maybe it was Vicky, I can't remember. Either way, whoever it was that came up with Tuesday at 2, it's a wonderful thing. Today we're going to be talking about the hip and why proper body mechanics and pelvic strength are so important to maintaining mobility of this super important joint, and how this joint can have an effect on your entire body. I mean, it is kind of the hub, right, of our body. It's the middle point. Legs come off of it, spine come off of it, and arms come off of that. So we are talking about a really important part of our body. Before we get into that, I know so many of you, but just in case we have some new people, I do want to introduce myself. My name is Paige Corley. I'm a health educator, or a health educator with the health promotion team here at Aging and Adult Services. And I've been here since May of 2019. And I've said this before, I've basically had my job as long without COVID as I have had it with COVID, maybe even longer. And even though I don't like COVID, I really do like what we've come up with post-COVID. We're pretty, all of us are pretty good at juking and jiving and adapting to the situation. I oversee the Enhanced Fitness, Walk with Ease, and Arthritis Foundation exercise programs here at the Aging and Adult Services. And of course, I'm certified in all of those programs. I got my master's in kinesiology in 2017. And I've been a personal trainer and a group exercise instructor since 1995. I love teaching to the older adult, mainly because fitness takes on a different meaning. It can still mean athletics, but it also means longevity, and it means independence. And for me, exercise has always meant mental and emotional well-being as well as independence. Always. It was never an athletic adventure or meaning for me. And it also, of course, is health. So we're going to talk about the hip, and I think we all know this song, right? The backbone's connected to the hip bone. That might not be the actual words. The hip bone's connected to the thigh bone. The thigh bone's connected to the knee bone. You know, our whole body is connected. And surprisingly, medicine and physical therapy and problem solving when it comes to the body, and realizing that just because it's your knee that hurt, it might not be your knee that needs physical therapy, or it might not be your knee that's actually injured. It might be another part of your body that's affecting that knee. And that's actually relatively new. It used to be if your knee hurt you, they looked at your knee only. Now, when someone tells me their knee hurts, I rarely think it's the knee. I almost always go to the hip first thing. And then once I can make sure that the hip is taken care of, that there's no dysfunctional patterns, then we can look at the knee itself. So everything's connected. But today we are talking about the hip, which again is that hub. It's the central part of our body. It has a lot to do with how our legs function. It has a lot to do with how our core functions. And our core, of course, out of that comes our spine and our upper body. So it really is kind of that hub. And if you were on the webinar, I think it was a couple weeks ago, maybe it was a month ago, who knows, on the shoulder, we talked about how the shoulder affects so much of that upper body. The hip is even more that hub. It affects even more of our body. So it's really something that we want to be somewhat educated on and aware of how it's going to affect us. So I have a picture, a little bit of anatomy, because I'm kind of geeky like that, and it's kind of fun to learn about it. So I'm just going to have to move my picture so I can see what I've written here. Okay, great. So I'm going to give you a very, very watered down version of the hip. It is a ball and socket joint, and it is actually a relatively stable joint, unlike the shoulder, right? The shoulder wasn't stable at all. You know, that's part of why the shoulder has so many issues. But the hip joint is relatively stable, but it still can move in quite a few directions, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But if you kind of look at these two side pictures, you can kind of see the right and the left sides of the pelvis. It's kind of split down the middle. And then how the hip joint, the ball and socket, kind of comes in at an angle to the pelvis. which creates a little bit of an angle down to the knee. Maybe some of you have heard of the Q angle. That's something that is more prevalent in women because of our bigger hips. And that just means an increased angle from the hip to the knee. And that, of course, causes and can cause some knee issues. And the reason is you can kind of see that if that angle from the hip to the knee is pronounced, you know, that knee joint's only supposed to flex and extend. It's only supposed to move this way. It's not supposed to move side to side. So if you have that kind of side force coming in on the knee, that can cause all of those ligaments and tendons of the knee to become injured, especially with overuse, with time. So if you have dysfunctional movements at your knees, you might not notice it in your 20s or your 40s. You might not start to notice it till your 60s, that overuse injury that is going to happen with the medial ligament, especially, sometimes that lateral ligament. And you can see that knee, because the knee joint only flexes and extends, it's going to have an effect on the lower leg. It's going to affect that ankle. How we walk is very much tied into our hip joint. So our lower extremity is very, very, very much affected by our hip joint. And you see that it's affected muscularly as well, but definitely by bones, right? There's a very, very strong connection there. Okay, let's see here. So now we're going to look at the muscle. No, okay, the movements, right? The movements of the hip, and you probably know this, right? The movement, again, it's stable, but it has quite a few directions. So again, the knee flexes and extends. It's got two motions that it can do, but the hip can flex and extend, and flexion is moving the legs forward. That's flexion of the hip. And the extension is moving the leg back. Hip extension is when you pull that leg behind you. So of course we flex and extend when we walk. During gait, you're going to have flexion and extension. Imagine if you're sitting for a long time, your hip is going to be in that flex position for a extended period of time. We're going to talk about that and the effects that that can have on your body. The leg also does abduction and adduction. Adduction is bringing the legs towards one another. Abduction, abduction is taking the leg out to the side. And these are things that we're going to do when we play sports, when we dance. Some warm-ups have us do adduction and abduction with our hips to just kind of warm up all of those muscles. One of the two of the motions that we stop doing unless we're dancing, unless we're involved in athletics, is we kind of stop doing abduction and adduction. And that has a major detrimental effect on the structure of the hip, the muscles involved with the hip, and our ability to balance, because a lot of the duties of our hip is to stabilize, right? It's to stabilize that pelvis so our legs and our upper body have something solid to work against. And I think in a presentation I've used that analogy of shooting a cannon off a canoe. That canoe's not stable. So when that cannon goes off, the canoe just pushes back, and that cannon has no power because it has nothing solid to put its force against. And with that analogy, our hips become that canoe. We want to make that canoe solid. We want to take that cannon off of the canoe and put it on the ground. So our hips can be ground, which is solid and allows that cannon to have really good force. Our hips can kind of be like that canoe and not have a lot of force there. And that means that our arms and our legs aren't as strong as they really could be. And this is something you hear a lot in Pilates, right? They talk about a strong core. And after you have a strong core, your arms and your legs are going to be stronger. So all related to the hip, definitely. And then the other two movements that we can do at the hip joint, at that ball and socket joint, is the internal and external rotation. And I don't know when we do internal and external rotation, other than like golf swing or swinging a tennis racket, whenever your heel goes up, dancing probably, whenever your heel kind of kicks out. one of the issues is some of us walk with a permanent external rotation, right? Our toes are constantly facing outward. And so that is going to cause those muscles that externally rotate the leg to become shortened, right? And we've talked about the length tension relationship. We're going to talk about that again today. But so that's why we really want to think about getting those feet so that all 5 toes face forward. And then of course there's the inward rotation, which is very interesting, because if you're born and as a little kid, you know, a toddler, you are internally rotated, which I don't know if it's PC to say anymore, but back in my day it was called pigeon toed, when you had that internal rotation. And oh my gosh, did they do a ton to correct that, right? Races and physical therapy and everything else. I never heard anybody talking about this external rotation and how detrimental that could be. Of course, dancers, ballerinas, that's how they walk. Well, ballerinas have some hip issues probably as they get older. Maybe not, but I would guess that they might. So we can internally and externally rotate the muscle, at the hip joint, and that's something that I do in some of my classes on purpose, just to kind of stretch those muscles out. Excuse me. So next we're going to look at actual muscles, and I know this isn't a great picture, but I mean the quality of it isn't translating very well, but it's such a good picture of the muscles in the torso. I just don't know how many of you are aware of how many muscles attach just in the pelvis area, or how many muscles pass through the pelvis to connect to our legs, pass up through the pelvis to connect to our vertebrae, and that's that psoas muscle. That's the big one that you see that attaches to the lower vertebrae and actually passes through the inner opening of the pelvis and then attaches to the femur, right? So it's a hip flexor. So again, if you're sitting a lot, which most of us do, doesn't matter how active you are, doesn't matter your age, if you're working, you're sitting. Those psoas muscles get really tight. And look how internal that muscle is. It's super, super, super internal to our body. It's, you know, it's at our spine. So it's way, way in there. It's hard to manipulate. If anybody's ever had their psoas adjusted, it's fairly invasive. You got to know the person who's doing it for sure, right? Because they're all up in your abdominal area. I've had it done. It's yeah. You can see all the muscles that are on the inside of the pelvis. So the pelvis kind of shaped like a bowl. There's muscles all on the inside. There's muscles all on the outside, which they're not showing here. We got muscles that attach to the inside, or the medial part of the femur, and attach up to the actual pelvis. And a lot of these muscles that are here are stabilizing. And when I remember what I mean stabilize, it means taking that cannon off of the canoe and putting it on solid ground. So when these muscles are all functioning in the way that they should be, our hips become like the ground. It becomes very, very stable. And that means that our movements can be much more efficient and effective. Let's see what I've written here. When we walk or run, our hips function as stabilizers, right? And the hip and the mini muscles surrounding it help to stabilize not only the hip, but also the legs. So again, tying in why we have knee issues, if your hips are all loosey-goosey and your knees are able to move medial and laterally, when they're really only meant to flex and extend, we're going to have wear and tear on those ligaments of the knees. And sometimes, and we're going to talk about knee valgus in just a little bit, that's that internal falling of the knees. Sometimes that's just a genetic set, right? That's just how we walk. That's just how our bodies are made. But once you realize that you do that, you can do things to counter it that will help with wear and tear on your knee. So if you haven't Googled hip muscles and looked at images, I strongly suggest you doing that. I have a slide during this presentation called Geek Corner, where I give you some videos that you can watch and some articles that you can read. So, but if you're into really looking at this, go ahead and Google that. It's pretty awesome. All right, so again, sorry about the quality, not the best quality, but I just wanted to show how these are all, especially on the left and the right sides of the picture here, you can see that these are all surface muscles, right? We got on the interior picture, we have a representation of the more internal, the deeper muscles, less superficial muscles of the hip. And on the lateral sides, we have the more surface, more superficial muscles. And there's a ton of them. I mean, there's just a ton that attach up in that hip. All of the muscles of our legs, all the muscles that, I mean, there are muscles that attach. If you could see on the left-hand side of your picture, and it's hard to tell, but it's called the Satorius muscle. It actually attaches to the upper part of your pelvic arch. You know, I know that has a word, I can't think of it right now, and it runs medially past the knee joint and actually attaches below the knee on one of the knee bone, one of the lower leg bones. That's one of the longer muscles it might be the longest muscle in the body. And then there's muscles that attach, obviously a ton that attach to the knee joint or right around the knee joint, above the knee joint, that they have a lot to do with hip flexion, right? So there's a lot that goes into hip flexion and hip extension. There are a lot of muscles that aid us in abduction and adduction. And then there's all those really internal muscles that help to stabilize. So, excuse me, when we're walking and we want our legs to go forward in a thoughtful pattern, and our knees, we don't want our knees wobbling all over the place. It's those stabilizers that are doing that. So it's not just a big gross movements of flexion and extension that we need to be aware of with our hips. It's all those muscles that stabilize that hip joint so that the leg can swing forward and back effectively and efficiently without causing that extra wear and tear on the hip joint and on the knee joint, and by association the ankle joint. So knee pain can be traced to weak hips. Excuse me. So like I said at the beginning of the presentation, when somebody says, I have knee pain, how can I strengthen my knees? And some of you have asked me that question. I almost always say, well, we need to strengthen your hip first, especially if you're having medial knee pain. That's pain on the inside of your knee. If you have pain on the outside of your knee, then most likely we also need to not strengthen your hip, but strengthen it, but also stretch it. But our glute medius muscles and the glute medius and minimus muscles, which are on the side of the hip, those are ones that often become either too tight to effectively contract and extend, or they just become weak from lack of use, dysfunctional movement patterns. And so you can see in this next picture, these are two representations of, on the left-hand side, I believe, what you guys are seeing. This is that knee valgus. This is that knee that falls medially. And you can kind of see that dotted line. It actually goes in and it comes back out to the ankle. And this, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, this can be traced back to a stabilizer in the hip that's not working. It's not doing its job. It's not holding that knee straight, as you can see in the right-hand side, that picture on the right-hand side. Usually, in many cases, it is a muscle that's just not firing. Why is it not firing? I don't know. Maybe it's a genetic setup. Maybe it's something that you've just done your whole life and it's never really caused a problem, again, until you're in your 50s or 60s. It might be from injury. It might be from a muscle that's overly tight, that's not allowing the muscle that's supposed to stabilize this motion to do its job. Who knows? That's why physical therapists have to get their MDs now, right? They have to go through medical school. Oh my gosh, because there's so much to consider. So if you're looking at this picture and you're like, wow, that's me, then there are some things that we can do to strengthen the hip muscle. This is something that I do. My body does this. I really have to be thoughtful to not let my knees fall in. And it's not something that, you know, I did. I never injured myself. I think it's just, I bet if you looked at my mom or my dad and how they walked, you would see this pattern as well. It's probably just genetic setup. And the thing is, I can protect my knees by being aware of it, doing the things I can to counteract. And it doesn't matter if you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm 80. I can't do anything about it. I've been walking this way for 80 years. Nope, you can do something about it. You absolutely can do something about it. All right, so let's look at these glutes, the glute medius and glute minimus, two of my favorite muscles of the body, actually, because they're underappreciated. They do a really important job. They really do a lot of stabilizing of the femur, right? That's the lower leg muscle, that big old muscle. I mean, the lower leg bone. They also aid in adduction, taking the leg out to the side. That's a big one that they do when they contract and extend. But they also do a lot of stabilizing. So you want to make sure that you keep these muscles healthy. And healthy doesn't just mean strong. It means strong and flexible. Because remember, mobility is a combination of strength and flexibility. If you're not strong and you're not flexible, oh my gosh, there's big trouble. And if you're flexible but you're not strong, you're going to still have a hard time moving that joint. And if you're strong but you're not really flexible, you're also going to have a hard time moving at that joint. So I have a few pictures here that kind of show different exercises that you can do to strengthen the glute medius and glute minimus. These are ones that we do in some of the classes that I am involved with. I don't necessarily teach, other people teach. You can do these seated, right? You sit and take your knee out to the side and back in, jumping jacks, right? These two people have bands around their ankles to do added resistance. Could also ankle weight around your ankle. Also step laterally, do some steps side to side. Right, that's going to it's going to come back. Hang on, it'll come back. If I can't mute none. This, am I back now? Maybe, yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, the volume goes in and out. Sometimes it's not that you have to do these exercises to work the glute medius and glute maximus. You can do a lot of things. You can play sports. You can use proper form when you pick up packages. You can dance. You can remember that your body doesn't just move linearly forward and back. It also moves side to side. Use your body. That's another way. But here are some exercises that you can do that are very effective in keeping these muscles healthy and strong. Glute maximus. So this is the big muscle. You see that, I'm going to go back one. You see that glute medius and glute maximus, glute medius is kind of underneath the glute maximus. You can see the glute maximus on this picture. It's the big muscle. That's more superficial. And then you can see that glute minimus is way underneath that glute maximus, and the glute medius is partially hidden by the glute maximus. That obturator internus is probably an internal rotator. Oh my God, how are we supposed to get to that guy? He's way under there, but there are ways you can. But so anyway, just a little bit better picture of that glute maximus. It's the thing that makes up our buns. It's the powerhouse of our body. Our glutes are, besides our bones, probably one of the most underappreciated parts of our body, right? If you're in my osteoporosis workshop, the bones are we just don't think about them, but without them, we can't function. And the glute is one of those muscles that really is so important to our function, but instead our brains choose to use our low back, which is such a bummer because our glute maximus is so much more effective than our low back. So a great way to get back in touch with your glute maximus is what this person is doing, that's laying on the ground, heads up to the ceiling, hands are down, feet are flat on the floor, and they're just raising their hips up towards the ceiling. This is called a glute bridge. One of the problems with this exercise is people use their low back. And so if you've taken one of my classes, whenever we use the glutes, I'm like, you got to squeeze your butt here. Even if you don't want to squeeze your butt, even if you can do this exercise without squeezing your butt, I want you to squeeze your butt to get back in touch with that glute maximus, because it's such, again, a powerful muscle. The person in this picture is doing a very, very good job. It does look like they are squeezing their rear end and not just using their back. They have a nice, good decline from their knee down to their kind of chin. And then it also looks like they are keeping their knees together, right? They don't want their knees to fall out or fall in, keeping their knees right at that hip width. So there's a lot to it, Another exercise you can do is a rear leg raise, which is where you stand and you just extend your leg. Your glute is in charge of hip extension. That's standing up and pressing your hips open. If you sit all day, what do you think happens to your glute maximus? It's stretched out and it loses that ability to contract to its fullest potential. Just like a muscle that's super tight loses its ability to contract to its full potential. So the glute has to work against a super tight, remember the psoas muscle? That psoas muscle that runs from the bottom part of the spine to your femur. This has got to counteract. If that gets super tight, then your glute has to be able to be strong enough to lengthen that psoas so you can stand up. Notice how many people, when they stand up, they never really fully extended their hips. They're always just partially bent over. And that's due to a really tight psoas muscle and or that weakened glute maximus. So we need to spend time getting back in touch with those glutes. That rear leg stand, what else? You guys know, sit to stand, right? Sit to stand. It is the golden child of the exercise world. Squats. It's a nice way of saying squats. But squats are a great way. You go into hip flexion and then you have to push out into hip extension. So we want to get back into doing those types of exercises, taking those legs back, taking them to the side. Glute bridge. You can do this in your bed if you don't like getting on the floor. It's not as effective as a bed soft, but it's better than nothing. All right. Next, okay, so I wanted to talk about the squat and the deadlift. Here's a pretty neat depiction of a person bending down to grab a box and standing up with good form. One of the things that's really, I think, well depicted in this picture is how straight this person's back is. Super, super straight. Notice the entire time. The only time it even bends the slightest bit is when they're reaching the full extension to grab the box. Otherwise, that back is really, really flat. This person is using the flexion at their ankles and their knees and their hips to lower their body to the ground. They're not using the articulation at their spine to lower their body to the ground. Gardeners, hey man, it's coming up, right? We're going to start to see those little buds peeking their heads through the dirt. Guess what? This is how you want to weed. It's not standing with those straight knees and straight ankles and just bend at the hips and articulate at the spine. That's going to give you a ruptured disc. I'm trying to think of the word. A herniated disc, right? We don't want those. But this person is going to avoid that because they're using all those joints in the lower leg and the hip to grab that box. So what does that say to me? That you're going to want to include squats, which are your sit to stands, and deadlifts, which are kind of like a bending over and picking up grocery bags, that type of a motion in your workout. And I have videos on the YouTube channel that depict these exercises, their explanations, and also incorporated into workouts. And I didn't want to leave out another part of the hip and the muscles of the hip is the pelvic floor. And the pelvic floor is getting some PR these days. We are learning more and more and more about the pelvic floor and how it can make your life somewhat uncomfortable. Look at all those muscles. That's just the opening. That opening, there's nothing there except soft tissue. That's just a big hole in that bone. That's all muscle. That muscle is holding in a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of organs. And these muscles are out of sight, out of mind, right? We don't think about them because they're kind of involuntary, right? I don't think, my pelvic floor, there it is. I'm going to contract. And, you don't do that. Well, now you're supposed to, right? You got the Kegel exercises, right? And I showed this picture again of the glute bridge because this is a wonderful opportunity to do not only your glute maximus muscles, but also all of those pelvic floor muscles. So again, if you suffer from incontinence, whether that be bowels or urine, it doesn't matter. This is going to be something that you're going to want to be aware of, is that pelvic floor. And there are a lot, the good thing is, because it's become such an issue, there's a lot more research into it. We have a lot more answers to questions. We have a lot more solutions, or at least things that you can try with the pelvic floor muscles to help you out. So I just think that's a great picture. I mean, holy moly, our bodies are amazing. So many muscles, super interesting. All right, so let's talk about, as we get towards the end here, if you were in my shoulder presentation, again, whenever that was, we talked about the upper cross syndrome and how if you sit for a long time with that rounded upper back, you get tight muscles in the front that can't contract and extend the way that they're designed to, and you get these loosened muscles stretched out in the back that again lose their ability to contract and extend. And so all of a sudden you have your length tension relationship is off, right? The same thing can happen at the hip joint. If no matter if you have a pelvic that tips under, right, towards the front, and imagine if your pelvis was full of soup. If you tip your hips under, the soup falls out the back. If you extend, if you kind of tighten your lower back and your hips kind of push towards the back of the room, the soup will fall out the front. And both are pretty prevalent out there. And most of us have one or the other. We either have a flattened lower back or we have a shortened lower back. I personally have a shortened lower back. Oh my gosh. It caused me back pain all through my 20s, probably into my 30s, but I haven't had it since then because I finally figured out what it was. And I do things every day to counteract that standing position. So you see that, if you have weak abdominals, you probably have weak glutes. And if you have a tight, that psoas, iliopsoas muscle, or rectus femoris, which is one of the muscles of the quadricep, you probably also have a tight lower back. And those are the things that we kind of want to counteract. The stronger we can make our abdominals, the more we're going to get in touch with our glutes. Right? So everything's combined. And of course, what does this come down to? Posture. I was going to get to where I was going to tell you guys about posture, right? It's one of my favorite topics. Posture, super important. Here's a really nice depiction of if you have that anterior tilt, how your erector spinae, those your lower back muscles, are going to be really, really tight. So is your iliopsoas, that psoas muscle, that big muscle that I talked about. Those are going to both be really tight, and they're going to be hard to counteract because they're going to be tight. So the muscles that are supposed to balance those out most likely are loosened, right? They're not both tight at the same time. And so the muscles that we would need to strengthen are the rectus abdominis, right? The transverse abdominis, our abdominal muscles, and our glute maximus, right? Get in touch with that glute, make it a little bit stronger so that we can counteract those tight erector spinae and iliopsoas and rectus femoris. So basically, we need to even out that length tension relationship. And one of the best ways we can do this is try to sit and stand in proper posture. All right. I mean, the best way to get our body back into the length tension relationship that it was meant to have is to spend most of our time practicing it. And yes, doing exercise is super important. There is no doubt about that. Everybody should be exercising every day in some way, shape, or form. Focused exercise. But that's only for what, 30 minutes a day, 45 minutes a day. If you're crazy like me, maybe it's an hour, hour and 15. What about the other, let's say that you're awake for what, 18 hours a day about? So that leaves us like 16 and a half hours. What are we doing for those 16 and a half hours? Are we standing with a anterior tilt so that we're just tightening up that lower back and tightening up the psoas and not giving our glutes or our abdominals any attention? So what we do in our day-to-day life really does affect how our body functions. And worse off, if you get to where these, let's say that you have that anterior tilt where that erector spinae tight and your rectus femoris are tight, and you kind of have that constant bend in the hip. When you exercise, you're just going to reinforce that, because that's how your body has adapted. Our bodies are highly adaptable, which is awesome and kind of a pain at the same time. So posture. And again, we have videos. I just did a new video of a posture reset. The main thing is lengthen your body up towards the ceiling, pull in your belly. When you pull in your belly, you almost have to do a little bit of a Kegel, and you almost have to do a little bit of a contraction in your glute maximus. They just kind of go together. So as much as possible, keeping your neutral spine where it needs to be. So the next component, and we're almost done here, are stretches. And I found this poster. I thought it was pretty good and pretty comprehensive. So I went ahead and just cut and pasted it here. One of the things I wanted to point out is this top left one. This person's doing the standing camel pose. If I tried to do that, I would fall over backwards and probably suffer a concussion. But you know what's the next best thing to the standing camel pose? Is just standing in good posture. What the camel pose does is accentuates that extension at the hip. But if we simply find that extension at the hip, that will do it as well. But you can see all of these kind of have a theme, right? The standing lunge, that back leg, that's the leg that's being opened. It's being extended. The leg is behind that person, and the hip is being opened, being extended. The garland pose, ooh, that's a toughie. That's kind of a standing squat. Both heels should be on the ground. I can't do this one. And that person has their elbows on the inside of the knees. If you can get into that stretch, more power to you. It's awesome. It's a hard one to get into. The seated butterfly, right? Sitting down, soles of the feet together, let the knees fall out to the side. If you have tight hips, do you see how this person's knees are way low? Well, when I sit, my knees are way high because I got super tight hips. Pigeon pose, you can kind of see towards the bottom, laying on the ground and bringing your knees into your chest. That's a good stretch. But also you can see that at the very bottom, the supine pigeon pose, this is a little bit easier one to do. This person has crossed their right ankle to their left knee. They want to flex that right ankle, and then they're pulling that left leg off of the ground to accentuate the stretch. For some, just putting your foot on your knee is plenty of a stretch. Pigeon pose is another yoga pose. I can't do the pigeon pose. That one doesn't work for me. The seated IT band, that's a twist, right? They're seated, crossing one foot over the other, and then twisting towards the knee. This can be done seated very easily. One of the stretches that I think, what I was going to say is why there's such a focus on opening the hips is because we sit with our hips closed, right? Anytime we're seated, our hips are closed. And again, being seated all day is not a sign of laziness. It's a sign of driving, of being on the computer. There's so many reasons why we might sit. So I don't want anybody to confuse a seated position with a sedentary lifestyle. Do you know what I mean? So it's not a hit on anything other than that's just part of life. We just do have even the fetal position is closed hips, and there's nothing wrong with the fetal position. That's what we do when we lay, right? It's comforting. So I mean, but as much as possible, we want to try to open those hips. And again, one of the best defenses is standing, right? Standing desk, getting up and trying to stand for 30 minutes of every hour, or at least trying to stand for half the time that you're awake. All right, so here's, as promised, my geek corner, and I'm going to put these in the chats. These videos are, amazing. I'll put them in just a second because I can't do it in this thing, but I will put them in there. These videos are really awesome. So if you're kind of a geek like I am, and you like to really learn this stuff, if you haven't seen what the youngsters get to see as far as anatomy these days, it's crazy. I went through school in 2017. The anatomy pictures were so awesome. You could really see where muscles were attached and where they were, attachment sites. I mean, just phenomenal. Whereas if you're over 50, we grew up with two-dimensional, right? We didn't grow up with three-dimensional. That wasn't part of our education. Well, it is now. So there's also these articles. These I got from CrossFit. They're written articles. I do have pictures. They're really great depictions and descriptions of the hip. So again, I'll put those in the chat while we're doing Q&A if you would like to look at them. So with that, real quick week, tonight we're going to be exploring the blue zones, which according to the long, healthy life, blue zones are areas of the world where, okay, hang on, it'll come back. It'll come back. Am I back now? Back now? Okay, great. Where people seem to live longer and healthier, not just longer, but healthier lives. So Erica, our good old Erica, who saved me today, is going to be presenting that. So join us next Tuesday for that. In the meantime, questions. What can I answer for you? And you can put it in the links in the description. Add the links in the description. I can see what we have in the chat. Oh, good. Okay. Yes, I can send. You know what? Yeah, I'll work on sending copies of the exercise to you guys. I'm not promising that, but I will do my best to get that to you. Okay. Definitely. Yep. Any questions? Anything I can clarify?
Oh, are you going to send that flyer out like the other lady asked about the stretches?
I will do my best to get those to you. I will do my best.
Okay.
All right.
So what was my problem this morning with signing on?
I don't know. Let me get to if there's any other questions, Jane, and then we'll talk about that. All right. Are there any questions specific to this presentation that anybody has out there? No? Okay. No? All right. Well, thank you all for joining me. I'm still putting these links in the chat, so hold tight. Those are the videos, and here are the links to the let's see, to the CrossFit articles that I found really, really interesting. And so you're welcome to copy those if you like. Casey.
Where can we open these? Will they be in our email or do we have to be on WebEx?
The links that I've put in the chat, is that what you mean,
Yes.
Casey?
Yes.
You
Yes.
can cut and paste these actually and just open them on your internet. These will all just open on your internet. They're just links to different websites. So
Okay,
the
thank you.
YouTube videos, are both anatomy videos, and they're on YouTube. And the CrossFit are on the CrossFit website. If you haven't gone on the CrossFit website in a long time, you should. They're really angling and gearing towards older adults. It's really a much safer experience, but mainly they just have some good content for you if you're interested in that. And you
Okay.
can cut and paste these, or I will again try to get these to you, these links. I'll talk with Monica and see if I can get those out to you guys.
Okay, thank you.
Monica, thank you, Paige.